Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
The Print Off The Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank, in association with global insurance brokers Airline Partner SpiceJet, in alliance with Indraprasth Apollo Hospitals.
One of the great rivalries, Cathy and I thought, quitting that movie, is ISI and the RAW. And in many ways, it's as important, if not more important, in that everything that happens in the fashioning of that rivalry, and that happens broadly within the region, has told us a story about ourselves and has illuminated something about the period that we live in now. And I'm not just talking about the the war on terror period. I'm talking about everything post-partition. It's been a fairground ride. It's been an extraordinary ride of political impulses, movements, wars, insurgencies that involve the great game, the invisible game, the lesser game. Gloved hands, lots of forces, both overt and covert, that are operating. It's the world's best story, the biggest story for us. And the idea that you could try and create some kind of oral history became our challenge. This immediately became apparent that the idea of putting this on film was not going to work because spies don't like to talk in front of cameras, and it would be challenging enough just to get a significant number of people who are both operators, clandestine, overt, analysts, etc., working in these two most secret agencies just to talk. We had one thing going in our favor, just to sort of get to the end of this rather lengthy reply, and that was that we've stuck around. Several decades later, almost three now, the people that we met when we were kids and who couldn't tell, Hizbul Mujahideen from Hezbollah, grew up alongside other sources who themselves became quite senior in organizations. And because we had a mantra from the beginning of not falling out with anyone and trying never to lie and never to deceive about who we are and what we're doing, we didn't lose many friends and contacts.
So what are the similarities between RAW, RAW and ISI, and where are the differences? Give me two of each.
Okay, I don't know whether I can. I think the broadest one, and the one that would take the longest to explain, is that although Pakistan is characterized as the ISI in particular as an organization that prefers to use proxy forces, actually India and Pakistan both have been extremely successful using proxy forces. Pakistan's story, which is projected very loudly by India and also has been the subject of much soul-searching vis-a-vis Afghanistan, etc., is a story of proxy warfare. I mean, from its inception and the creation of ISI and the earliest operations prior to ISI with nascent young Pakistan, proxies were used in Kashmir to try and win that off, steer the state away from India. So the proxy story is a story of Pakistan. Pakistan shaped proxies in the 60s and the 70s with the help of CIA. And the first thing they did as force multipliers, as you and I know, is focus on India's fault lines. And those fault lines included, Punjab, the Northeast, Kashmir, and America helped give them the skills that they would need to form paramilitary organizations that could then exacerbate problems inside those fault line areas. But at the same time, one can chart the way that this grows through, the Afghan-Soviet war, and obviously the growth of political Islam and Islamism. And then you have, your Lashkar-e-Toibas, and you have your sectarians with Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, and you have Hizbul Mujahideen growing up for the Intifada, the insurgency, in Kashmir. And then, this mitosis takes place as the cells split and they create new organizations. And Pakistan puppeteers a lot of these. But at the same time, India was remarkably successful doing something very, very similar. But the difference between the two nations is that India didn't become the focus of those operations and projected itself as an idea that was forged by Indian intelligence was the creation of Ikhwan and renegades. And in 94, 95, when mass surrenders were engineered.
You talk about Kuka Pare and stuff.
Kuka Pare. And there are so many more. I mean, basically, there are hundreds of them, thousands, in fact, in terms of foot soldiers. And the idea of triggering mass surrenders in Kashmir and getting Kashmiris to fight Kashmiris was not an idea that was born in Kashmir. It's an idea that was born in Northern Ireland, in the 6 counties. And a group of intelligence officers were taken for training. They were placed with the Royal Ulster Constabulary in the UK, and there they got to see one of the world's most brutal and bloody counterinsurgencies, which involved obviously Catholic and Protestant communities in the 6 counties. And we don't need to tell the story of the IRA in this broadcast. The officers came back and they used what they learned from ruthless prosecution of that war, where organizations were infiltrated, puppeteered, and steered. And they did the same in Kashmir. They did the same in Andhra Pradesh. They did the same in the Punjab. And many of the events that you will see that take place, the dividing of organizations, the dividing with Hizbul Mujahideen, the dividing with the renegades, the dividing of the Khalistan movement, which is a story that's been well told, and in Andhra Pradesh as well, with the Maoist struggles, took place with officers who honed their ideas in the 6 counties, and also then later had mentorship and training in Israel, where puppeteering and the use of these organizations was the ploy of Indian intelligence against Palestinian outfits like PLO, PLFP, Black September, etc. Penetrate, manipulate. That became, a great mantra for Indian intelligence. And so what we can see in this, just the beginnings of this conversation, is that there are many things that remain unknown, that are never said about the success of a second great example of trying to seize that space and shape the narrative, is in sowing the idea that the ISI funded Al-Qaeda and the 9/11 plot. Brilliant work by RAW. It fed that story into a whole series of news agencies in India. It laminated together some cases that had happened in the past involving young Islamists, nascent Islamists growing up in India and operating in West Bengal. And it created a grand cake from this of truth and false in many different layers, which became a story that was so attractive that it then became the subject of the 9/11. Part of the 9/11 inquiry would be repeated for years to come. And it's one that shot through with a kind of Islamophobia. Islamic Nation naturally, finds itself a bedfellow with Islamic terrorists. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. All the subsequent inquiries found out ISI did not fund 9/11. ISI was not akin or adjacent to Al-Qaeda. And General Mahmoud, who was the ISI DG, the big chief, who was dismissed. Yeah, he was kicked out for different reasons altogether. They wanted someone who was more American-centric. They wanted the great communicator, Ehsan al-Haq, to come in and do the job. Ehsan was a man who had traveled widely with enormous connections in the Gulf, a huge strategic brain, and someone who could ride the Americans and actually understand what was going on and reform ISI. But again, RAW, an extraordinary psychological operation, which then flavored the war on terror years to come. A recent book came out in Delhi in 2014 by one of the former bosses of the CBI, and he wrote in it about his early investigations into ISI funding of 9/11. That myth is pernicious. The seeds were planted by RAW, and they're still germinating today.
Now, Abdul Ghani loan assassination. Tell us the story.
So, in the case of Abdul Ghani loan, it's a fascinating story because a free thinker can increasingly be an unattractive proposition. And somebody who will not necessarily toe the party line can cause problems. And in Kashmir, the Hurriyat obviously had been formed at the behest of ISI. And ISI had sent a young captain over to work with one or two other select officers to bolt together using a whole series of money, persuasion, and political tools, a conference of peoples and outfits who would broadly represent either autonomy or succession in Pakistan. And of course, as we know, it had a military council, which largely speaking became, although not exclusively, became Hizbul Mujahideen, of course. And that would go in its own separate direction. But Abdul Ghani Lone was one of those people who was very much his own person, a free thinker, someone who had come to believe that there was no violent solution to anything, and that endless war only suited the prosecutors of the endless war, and that the people caught in the middle, the civilians and the wider Indian population, did not benefit from endless war. And a man like that caused problems. He caused problems because he wanted peace, and no one could guarantee which kind of peace he wanted. Was it a Pakistan peace, i.e. one in which Pakistan could revel, or was it an Indian peace put forward by I.B. Raw, who canvassed brilliantly for peace and came very near, almost successful, to achieving a peace in the Vajpayee years. But that would, of course, cause a huge embarrassment in Pakistan. And so even the concept of peace becomes politicized. Whose peace wins out? Whose war wins out? Who becomes the figurehead for the movement that declares itself as that which resolves Kashmir and the Kashmir struggle? Kulbhushan Yadav operation. Because the Kulbhushan Yadav operation, your viewers may remember the very, very unfortunate story of the Indian naval commander who was seized in Pakistan on where Pakistan rubs up with Iran, and then became a tug of war, between India and Pakistan over this man, who of course is married with children who are from Mumbai, family from Mumbai. And he became a political hostage, if you like, a bargaining piece. But his story, if we take that to pieces, illustrates something about the raw ISI interplay. Somebody who was traveling with multiple passports that projected him as being of a different faith to the one that his birth certificate suggests, that carry also mismatched details that gave away his story because he was being informally managed by many different agencies. And in fact, that may be a terrible disaster for everybody, let alone, most of all, for Yadav himself, in that I would say RAW operates with great professionalism. But the Yadav story is not one of great professionalism. It's a hasty, ad hoc operation, fooled around him by a lot of different security interests, which ultimately will have sacrificed him and his family. And it's a good example of how a spy game has serious consequences, if the right amount of backing is not there. The raid took place in Mumbai. All of that information has filtered down into RAW.
What happened? Why did the RAW not take it seriously enough?
Well, I think one can only conclude, one can only postulate here. We can come up with theories. Manisha and her kind, a group of people, believe that they didn't gain traction inside the organization. And the kind version of this says that complacency took place because RAW and IB was so successful at penetrating Lashkar-e-Toiba and Hizbul Mujahideen that they no longer really viewed them as an ardent enemy, and that they believed that they could be inside those cells, militarily defeat them without much of a headache. And so there was a lack of anticipation for the chaos that could be created with the capture of an entire city. That's the kind version. We could say that that would be the complacent story, a failure to gain traction, and maybe there's some personal issues. But Manisha identifies another trend within the organization, which you can trace right the way back to the creation of the proxy warfare within intelligence. And that trend is to allow things to run far longer in order that you get to see the big network and you create far more damage with your enemy. And there was a school of thought that perhaps if an operation would come about, that operation could be captured in time, it would also expose Pakistan, ISI, and absolutely once and for all kill off all American interest in Pakistan and tip things regionally in favor of India. At that time, India still remains largely unloved by the US.
Two incidents where you have some skepticism, and I'm sure you will get a lot of criticism in India. That is Pulwama and Parliament attack. You don't exactly buy the story. That is what people in India widely believe.
Yeah, I mean, I when I say buy, I think a lawyer said this to me. One can only believe what one is told. So one can look at the array of facts and reach a decision. Us as journalists, intelligence agencies as analysts, diplomats as diplomats, etc. We see the evidence and we judge the evidence. If we're not shown the evidence, then the story that's presented has been shaped. And so really what I have been looking at with Cathy in this book is the way in which evidence is shaped. And it's shaped by some bad actors, by people who have a record of being unreliable. And so understanding their trajectories and their motives and understanding what never turned up in court also explains why court never got a fair go. It's very important to say from the outset that while, and I'll get to this, while my conclusion may not be the same as some people's regarding, let's say, a very significant event like the Parliament attack, my belief deep down is not that the institutions are rotten or failing, the judiciary, the police service, and the intelligence services. Quite the opposite of that. But it's a belief that if information is withheld, then those services and those systems are stymied. And that is what I believe happened with the Parliament attack. Crucial pieces of data were withheld from the courts, from the police, and in fact, not only withheld, but some data was manufactured. And for the first time, we've managed to pull together the data that wasn't seen. I believe that I believe there's only a subtle difference in my reading of Pulwama and probably everyone else's. I believe that the work done on Pulwama is extraordinary, and I buy into it. I've seen quite a lot of the work that was put together by NIA, by the Border Security Force, the work that they did in capturing and analysing with lab work the handset that was recovered. And as your viewers will know, having read it in many, both in a great book by Rahul Pandita, The Lover Boy of Bahawalpur, and also in very good journalism that's been carried out in different outlets in India, that there was a Jaish cell that were behind Pulwama. I think these are incontrovertible facts. The difference is that I have a long history on the Pakistan side. So I can bring perhaps to this story a bit of the knowledge of what was going on inside the Pakistan side. And the story told excellently on the Indian side involves the NIA operation and BSF's actions. So when you consider things more holistically, an interesting thing to see is the role of ISI. So it's in the nature of these things that the first reaction of Indian security services is to project everything as ISI. And yet what you have here, when you look back at the trajectory of the people involved, is many of these people had themselves being hunted by ISI, having mounted serial and repeated attacks on GHQ, Rawalpindi, Musharraf, ISI commanders, corps commanders, and they had set up a new base in southern Afghanistan in liberated territory, lawless territory near to Lashkar, in between there, and another place in Host, where they've been training and operating for some time. And in fact, the more nuanced story is that they were shut down, and a lot of their operations, barring the odious Masood Azhar, had been shut down. Masood Azhar was being used as an interlocutor by ISI. He was shuttling up and down, attempting to carry messages with another group, Jaish al-Adl, who were causing problems for the Chinese. And ISI manipulated him in every way they could. But broadly speaking, Jaish, as it existed in 2002, as a fully paid up asset of ISI, causing harm to India, that has ceased to happen. They were enemy number one. They melded with Al-Qaeda. They flipped into Afghanistan, where they continue to work with Al-Qaeda. And what you see in Pulwama, if you look at the timing and the people involved and the forensics of the bomb, is you see another attempt to create regional conflagration and bring Pakistan and India to war. I'm broadly speaking an optimist. I always have been. I believe in, the reason for that is I believe in humanity more than the institutions. And as you yourself know, we would be treated as warmly in Amritsar as we would be in Lahore. And that's because the peoples are not the issues here. The geopolitics is. And we have to hold on to this, even now at this time, where we're all filled with insecurity and we worry about truth and the nature of truth. My only concern here is that because intelligence wars and political wars have come together and the battleground is far more intangible, and that battleground involves knowing what is right and wrong, we may be more confused in 3 years' time. And Pegasus is an issue that will be around when this conversation between us it'll still be there. But by that stage, today, when I logged onto the computer, I could see that there's an Israeli delegation on its way to the US, an Israeli delegation on its way to France. Macron will not take no for an answer. The only people who are not talking about this are India. India's not talking about Pegasus. And the reason India's not talking about Pegasus is because we're now at the pointy end of the proliferation of digital intelligence, and it has overtaken the capacity of legislature to act as an oversight authority.